that would be the appropriate way forward.
Thank you. That ends questions on the Culture Secretary's portfolio. The next item of business is a statement by Fergus Ewing on electricity market reform. The Minister will take questions at the end of his statement, and there should therefore be no interventions or interruptions. And I'll give a few moments for everybody to get settled. I now call on Fergus Ewing. Minister, you've got 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The recent UK Government amendment to its energy bill, debated in the House of Lords last week, will remove the Scottish Parliament's power and discretion over the renewables obligation in Scotland. The Scottish Parliament has twice now expressed support for electricity market reform's underlying principles if it remains consistent with Scotland's existing policies and priorities. However, EMR risks failing in its objectives. This has serious repercussions for our existing generation and security of supply in Scotland, as well as for our renewables potential and ambitions. The UK's amendment to the Energy Bill and its new power to close the renewable obligation, the RO, in Scotland is a cause for serious concern. Successive Scottish governments and parliaments have used these devolved powers to advance renewable generation across Scotland. This proposed removal of Parliament's discretion has caused consternation amongst stakeholders. This amendment cut through a live Scottish Government consultation. Decisions on issues such as grace periods, the flexibility beyond 2017 for stations which experience delays, a matter of huge importance to offshore and marine projects, will be taken out of Scotland's hands. I have written to Ed Davey seeking justification for his decision to neither consult nor seek the Scottish Parliament's agreement to this move. I also share the concerns expressed by Ofgem and National Grid about the risks to security of supply. Presiding Officer, electricity margins could drop to as little as 2% by 2015-16, a huge challenge to security of supply. The margin is the difference between the aggregate capacity to generate electricity and the peak demand. The equivalent Scottish margin is 20%, but in the medium term, we too could be at risk. Some think that Ofgem's assessment is in itself optimistic and that there should be a full-scale independent audit of capacity margins and security of supply. Scotland currently exports around a quarter of its output, helping keep the lights on across the UK. Take Longanet, Scotland's largest power station, which could feasibly meet a quarter of our annual electricity demand. Longanet needs significant investment. Ofgem's transmission charging review and the design of EMR's capacity mechanism are key factors. The UK Government's locational pricing methodology and the EMR will impact on Longanet. The current uncertainty also means that we have the ridiculous situation at Peterhead, where the station has derated from 1,800 to just 400 megawatts. Meanwhile, there are no plans to develop the new gas station at Cockenzie, which was consented 2 years ago due to UK energy policy confusion and uncertainties. Our thermal generation must be cleaner, and it can be. But these stations will power Scotland whilst new technologies are developed, balancing the grid and seeing the UK through this period of investment hiatus. The UK Government must ensure that EMR's capacity mechanism takes into account Scotland's role in providing secure supplies of power across the UK. The UK's proposals for offshore renewables are sorely limited, with forecasts for 8 gigawatts of offshore wind, a level which jeopardises Scottish Round 3 and Scottish Territorial Waters projects. Compare this with Scotland's higher ROC rock bands for floating offshore wind, support unmatched by the UK, just as its proposals for hydro degression jeopardise small schemes across Scotland. Hydro matters in Scotland. That's why we used our discretion, Presiding Officer, to maintain higher support under the RO than the UK. SSE, in fact, confirmed that its £30 million project at Glassa was explicitly linked to the Scottish Government's decision. Meanwhile, our intergovernmental work on support for island renewables shows that Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles could provide up to 5% of total GB electricity demand by 2030. However, the current UK Government proposals fall short of what is required to deliver this potential. The contrast with the UK Government support for imported nuclear technology could not be clearer. Consumers will pay up to £1,000 million each year for 35 years, over twice the 15 years available for renewable technologies. This contract will give new nuclear electricity double the current wholesale price for electricity. CCS is another concern. Peterhead Power Station and the Captain Clean Energy proposal at Grangemouth are excellent candidates for support. However, Professor Stuart Hazeltine spoke recently of the anger and depression felt by the sector at the UK Government's lack of progress. These factors create risks. Renewables fabrication at Nigg, Methil and elsewhere, research in Orkney, the export of machines invented in Edinburgh, Glasgow and Inverness, community ownership and community benefit across Scotland. These still move forward, but only if the right decisions are made. Costs remain a vital issue, quite rightly. Investment in new technologies comes at a price. Of course, offshore technologies and CCS have huge economic potential for Scotland and the UK, unlike nuclear, which is all cost and little benefit. Costs and benefits matter, particularly in the light of gas and electricity price increases. DEC's own research shows that renewables can deliver smaller bills in future than the status quo, a point seemingly lost in the UK Government's confused claims about green levies and costs. The Scottish Government takes the interests of vulnerable consumers extremely seriously. I have written to and spoken with energy companies seeking transparency and a commitment to protect those in need. We have maintained the Warm Homes programme even as it was abandoned south of the border. The Deputy First Minister has outlined how an independent government will ensure that the costs of vital energy efficiency measures are met centrally rather than from consumers. This will cut consumers' energy bills by approximately £70 a year, a fairer system in our view. In summary, Presiding Officer, this Parliament has supported the EMR process, but based on an outcome consistent with Scottish policy priorities and ambitions. Such an outcome now looks, at best, uncertain. The removal of Scottish parliamentary discretion in the matter of the RO is troubling and demands an explanation. The Chamber should also understand the threats posed by EMR to Scotland's renewables ambitions and our established position as a provider of secure energy supplies. The Scottish Government agreed to maintain a common energy market in 2011, and this Chamber has twice supported the process of EMR. And indeed, I can update Parliament that in the very last few hours, I have received a reply from Ed Davey. Presiding Officer, it's remarkable what a parliamentary statement can elicit. At least in tone, if not in substance, Mr Davey responds to some of our concerns. If this signals a change in approach, we will be the first to welcome that. However, as things stand, the concerns I've set out today remain. Should they be fully addressed, then we remain willing to sign a Memorandum of Understanding with DEC, giving form to our joint commitments, but not at the risk, Presiding Officer, of leading Scottish consumers as vulnerable to power shortages in the future as those south of the border are already facing over the next 2 years.
That ends the statement from the Minister. The Minister will now take questions on the issues raised in the statement and tend to allow around about 20 minutes for questions, after which we'll move on to the next business. It would be helpful if members who wish to ask a question were to press the request to speak button now. I call Ian Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to the Minister for his statement and advance sight of it. The Minister is absolutely right to emphasise the importance of electricity market reform to Scotland, and that is because, of course, of the crucial importance of a single integrated British electricity market to this country and to its future. With less than 1/10 of the population of the UK, Scotland's renewables industry benefits from over 1/3 of the subsidies for renewable energy paid for by consumers across the United Kingdom. So, for the sake of security of supply, our capacity to continue to export power, both mentioned by the Minister, and indeed the development of an industry in which the Scottish Government has largely bet our industrial future, we cannot afford to jeopardise that single integrated market. So the Minister is right that the United Kingdom Government must ensure that EMR takes account of Scotland's role in providing secure electricity supplies. I believe he is also right that this last-minute Lord's amendment was indeed no way to go about doing that. But I have to say that I am not sure that public and parliamentary row between the two governments involved is all that helpful either. I'm extremely glad to hear that Mr Ewing and Mr Davey are talking again, and I would ask the Minister to explain to the Chamber what action he plans now, following that contact, to get past this, to achieve agreement on EMR and to protect the single electricity market the industry wants and this country needs. Minister.
Well, I think Ian Gray is absolutely right to highlight the challenge which arises from security of supply. I mean, the first obligation of energy policy is to avoid power disconnections. And yet, Presiding Officer, we have seen from Ofgem and the National Grid and many other expert commentators that there are now very real risks of brownouts, of intermittent power supply and even blackouts facing England in as near as 2 years' time. We are extremely keen to avoid that occurring, and indeed, Scotland's thermal generation and capacity at Longannet, Peterhead, and indeed our two existing nuclear power stations have the significant capacity to supply that. So it's essential that the problem of security of supply is addressed, and that's why, Presiding Officer, I've suggested that an independent audit be considered in respect of these matters. With regard to the final question which Ian Gray asked, of course, I've sought to have and have had a constructive relationship with the ministers in the UK Government, and I hope that that would be recognised. That is what we want to continue. But it is absolutely right that we set out markers, Presiding Officer, about issues of very serious concern that we are hearing from industry, especially in the renewable sector, but also in the thermal generation sector, where stations such as Longannet are seriously concerned about various threats facing their continued operation in accordance with their ambitions. And finally, we are extremely keen to ensure that there is a workable system of connecting the islands to the opportunity to participate in the energy revolution in Scotland.
Honourable Fraser.
Thank you. Can I thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement? To deal with the Minister's last point first, can I welcome the fact that he has now had a constructive response from Ed Davey to his latest letter, although I sense that rather took the wind out of his sails. And can I express the wish that the healthy dialogue on energy issues that we've seen up until now between Scotland's two governments will continue. Presiding Officer, what we need in Scotland and across the UK is a balanced energy policy. We also need a properly informed debate. I was rather confused by the Minister's comments on the cost of new nuclear power and the partial picture he painted. The draft contract for different strike prices, I have them here, are as follows. Biomass, £105 to £120 per megawatt hour. Hydro, £95. Large solar photovoltaic, £125. Offshore wind, £155. Onshore wind, £100 per megawatt hour. As I'm sure the Minister well knows, the strike price agreed for the new nuclear station at Hinkley Point is £92.50, cheaper than wind, solar, hydro, biomass or tidal. And unlike wind, no problems with intermittency or unpredictability. Presiding Officer, the facts may not fit the Minister's narrative, but doesn't he have a duty to come to this chamber and give us the whole picture and not just the parts that suit him?
Minister.
Well, first of all, as I said, I'm keen to continue to maintain constructive relations with all UK government ministers, and that's the way I do my job. My primary duty is to stand up for the Scottish interest, and I've clearly expounded it, I believe, in the statement I've issued, Presiding Officer, today. Let me turn to the issue of nuclear, which formed the majority of Murdo Fraser's comments. Sadly, Mr Fraser hasn't really provided us with the whole story, because he's equiparated. Well, just wait a minute, you'll get the rest of it, Mr Fraser. Because, you see, he's equiparated and compared the headline rates of the proposed CFD. But what he's left out is a few other facts about that. Now, the length of the CFD contract in respect of offshore wind will be 15 years. But the length of the contract for nuclear will be 35 years.
Mr. Fraser,
35 years.
Mr. Fraser.
Mr. Fraser may not like this information, but it is information of a factual nature. The contract length that has been agreed between the UK Government and EDF will be 35 years, with an estimated £1,000 million a year, given that the station may not be, or stations may not be into commission until 2023. That means that UK consumers will be subsidising its output under the terms of the contract until 2060. And there's another difference, and that difference is in respect of decommissioning costs. And another fact that Mr Fraser chose not to mention is that the existing decommissioning cost of clearing up the UK's nuclear waste legacy at Sellafield has reached £67.5 billion, with no idea when the cost will stop increasing. And finally, Presiding Officer, the total cost in respect of subsidies to the nuclear industry is not far off being on a par with the subsidies for the renewables industry. So we believe that these are not the priorities of Scotland, and unlike the Conservatives, we see a different future ahead for Scotland in renewables, but that future is being placed potentially in jeopardy unless we can continue in a constructive vein the dialogue with the UK Government over these crucial coming months.
I now have many people who want to wish to ask the Minister a question. Can I remind members that they should only ask one question? Can we make it short, and can we have a brief response? In that way, we hopefully will get through everybody. Christian Allard, followed by Ken McIntosh.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thanks to the Minister for his statement. I would like to ask the Minister if the UK electricity market reform will allow an adequate subsidy to facilitate the development of offshore floating turbines and other innovative technologies.
Minister.
Well, I certainly hope that they will. At present, we have, using the powers that we have enjoyed under ROCs, set an incentive for floating and innovative offshore wind turbines to enable test and development of those. These are particularly suitable for Scottish waters, which are deeper, and therefore having a floating system has benefits in terms of cost in the long term, as opposed to those which have concrete bases or are fixed to the seabed. So it's essential that we further continue our work with a number of developers who are close to going ahead to investing in these floating and innovative turbines in Scotland. If they do, then one of the benefits is that places such as Kishhorn can reopen. If they don't, then they are unlikely to do. And that's why I have been pressing this case with the UK Government, and I very much hope that we will be able to work together to ensure that this vitally important nascent technology can receive the support that it needs to contribute towards our emissions targets, to generate electricity, and also to generate a considerable number of jobs in this country.
Ken McIntosh, followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And like Murdo Fraser, since meeting the Minister when he opened the new visitor centre at Hunterston, I've never been entirely sure of his views on nuclear energy. Today, he seems to have forgotten about Hunterston and Torness and has a go at nuclear. And can I ask him, because he was the one that made the comparison in the strike price, £92.50 per megawatt hour for nuclear, compared to £100 per megawatt for onshore wind and £155 per megawatt hour for offshore. How does he compare the investment lifespan for nuclear compared to that for wind farms?
Minister.
Well, the position on nuclear is absolutely clear. We have two existing nuclear power stations. They are generating electricity. We recognise that they are making a substantial contribution towards maintaining security of supply. electricity needs to come from a variety of sources, and as long as they can be safely operated, so they should continue to do. They have been purchased, erected, constructed a long time ago, and that applies to Hunterston and Torness, both of which, as Mr Macintosh has alluded to, I visited, and I mentioned them earlier, incidentally, contrary to his statement. However, the difference about new nuclear power stations is that this involves a massive amount of expenditure, and if one takes the two most recent examples of nuclear power stations which are being constructed in mainland Europe as we speak, EDF's project at Flamanville has increased to £8,000 million from the original estimate of £3.3 billion, more than double. It's 4 years behind schedule. Finland's fifth nuclear reactor is under construction now, is 6 years behind schedule, and has a cost overrun of up to £3.6 billion. I think it's sensible to learn from experience, Presiding Officer, and we should learn from experience that the cost overruns in new nuclear power stations are a very strong argument that they should not be adopted.
Willie Coffey, followed by Liam McCarthy.
Thank you. Does the Minister agree that Lungannet continues to be of significant importance to Scotland's energy needs, and does he share concerns over the impact here of transmission charges?
Minister.
Well, yes, I do. I had the pleasure of visiting Lungannet a few weeks back, and it supports 270 direct jobs. It has made a very substantial contribution to Scotland's energy needs. Mr Coffey raises the point of transmission charges. The transmission charges facing Lungannet in Scotland are estimated at between £20 and £30 million more each year than an equivalent power station in the south of England. So plainly, these additional costs are a burden that has to be paid and has to be met. And that does point to a discriminatory charging system across the UK and makes it extremely difficult for companies to replace existing thermal generation or indeed extend its life whilst we transition to a low-carbon method of generating our electricity needs.
Liam McArthur, followed by Mike Mackenzie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank the Minister for early sight of his statement. I'm disappointed at his decision to depart from his usual consensual approach and treat us to a bit of a rant. He argues rightly about the need for the renewable sector to have certainty and early warning, yet seems to have been happy to delay making clear his intentions on RO closure, despite knowing the timetable for the passage of the UK Energy Bill. Does he not accept that this will strike many in the sector as odd and suggest he's been happy to say one thing in private and another in public, but in a genuine attempt to encourage Mr Ewing back to more familiar, consensual waters, can I assure him of my support for an early meeting with DEC to consider the outcome of the consultation on island renewables?
Minister.
Well, that was a kind of mixed and varied couple of questions, but I can assure all members that I have made these points over a long period with DEC and set out Scotland's particular case, not least our support for Scottish Island renewables as a top priority for the Scottish Government. And I've welcomed on many occasions the fact that Ed Davey has had a consultation on an island strike price. However, the problem about that is that many of the consultees have indicated very clearly that one strike price for 3 islands will not form the basis of connections to all 3 island groups. And indeed, moreover, that is not surprising because the Baringa TNEI report, which was published this year and which was sought by both Mr Davey and myself to prove the need for the island connections, found that each of the island groups required individual strike prices. Now, that's a clear illustration of what's at stake here. Are we going to see the islands of Scotland, and Mr MacArthur will know far more about the island he represents than I do, but are we to see the islands connected, or are we not? We've got a shared objective, but it's essential that the method brought forward by the UK Government will be capable of delivering that objective. And it's absolutely right that I come here and set out concerns that he will be aware of, that have been expressed by many in industry and representatives of his own area in this way, in the hope that we can move from where we are at the moment to a set of proposals which will secure the objectives which Mr MacArthur rightly points out that we broadly share.
Mike Mackenzie, followed by Lewis MacDonald.
The Minister will be aware that EMEC, the European Marine Energy Centre in Orkney, we're at least 10 years ahead of the rest of the world in terms of wave and tidal energy research. Does you have a concern that this 10-year lead may be lost as those technologies approach commercialisation and need a clear subsidy and clear support?
Minister.
Well, I think there is a lack of certainty at the moment as to the incentive to be provided for the future of both wave and tidal energy, and I recently attended an expert group in Edinburgh just last week in relation to these matters. So I entirely agree that there is a will across both the UK and Scottish governments to support wave and tidal energy. I know Greg Barker is committed to this, and I will say so. But the question really is not whether there's a will and whether there's a shared objective, but whether the specific proposals that are going to be brought forward will be sufficient. And the delay in consideration of specific measures for wave and tidal in the islands does not seem to me necessarily to be helpful to securing that outcome.
Lewis MacDonald, followed by Chick Brodie.
In light of his statement, can the Minister confirm his government's continuing support for the European Offshore Wind Deployment Centre in Aberdeen Bay, which has attracted European Union funding? And can he tell us what constructive discussions he has had with UK ministers about the contribution of both offshore wind and offshore carbon storage to the future role of Aberdeen and the North East as a global centre of excellence in offshore energy?
Well, Presiding Officer, I think really is a matter of form, and with some hesitance, I should, given that this matter is sub judice in the courts in Edinburgh today, refrain from commenting in direct response, but I will write to Mr MacDonald in these matters.
Chick Brodie, followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have correspondence from the Deputy Prime Minister saying there will be no subsidies for nuclear energy. Can the Minister comment on the impact of the recently announced contract for difference strike price, which includes insurance as well as decommissioning, for the proposed Hinkley Point nuclear facility and its potential effect on investment plans for alternative and cheaper renewable sources of energy?
Minister.
Well, I think Mr Brodie does raise a good point. The CFD, which has been offered by the UK Government for Hinkley Point, is, broadly speaking, twice as much as the wholesale electricity price. And it's not clear what specific account has been taken of huge decommissioning costs in respect of this property. And he is right also to say that the subsidy does not just apply to CFD, but also applies to other financial obligations. This is a massive subsidy that the UK are committing taxpayers to from about 1923 till from about 2023 to about 2060. This is an enormous subsidy and has completely changed the dynamic of the equation. And meantime, Presiding Officer, the real concerns are about security of supply, of electricity supply in the UK, and that, it seems to me, is something that we must collectively give much more thought, and an independent audit would be the right first step.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. And turning to the House of Lords amendment which has prompted this statement, isn't it clear from the utter lack of informed debate amongst members of that chamber on the impact that this amendment would have in Scotland, that the House of Lords has once again shown itself as an unelected, antique and often semi-conscious chamber which simply is not fit to scrutinise legislation as it impacts on this country?
Minister, I'm going to go on to Stuart McMillan. That wasn't issues that were raised in the statement. Stuart McMillan.
I will work with a commoner or anybody to deliver the renewable ambitions for Scotland.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Minister agree that there is an important constitutional issue here as Westminster is looking to take back powers over the renewables obligation from the Scottish Ministers and the Scottish Parliament? And what does this say about the veracity of the No campaign when they talk about providing more powers to Scotland?
Minister.
Well, I think what we found disappointing was that this decision was taken without any prior consultation with this Parliament, Presiding Officer. I think that is, by any view, something which is at odds with the rhetoric and the promises that are being made in relation to another debate that's going on at the moment.
Before we move on to next business, and while I've got members in the chamber, can I just say that when we have a statement, questions are supposed to relate to the statement that the Minister has just made, and it should not include any other issues that are not relevant to that statement. We now move to the next item of business. Patrick Harvey.
Grateful to the presiding officer for raising that issue. Can the presiding officer explain whether a direct reference to process in the House of Lords is excluded from the issues that members are allowed to question? This is in paragraph 1 of the Minister's statement.
I think I've already made my point, Mr Harvey. I wasn't directly relating to you, although you raised yourself there. There were other issues raised by other members that were not included in the statement itself. And all I ask is that in future, when there is a statement, that we don't waste time by raising issues that are not there in the statement. We now move to the next item of business. It's a debate on motion number 8270 in the name of Keith Brown on modernising Scotland's transport infrastructure, meeting the challenges of the 21st century. Calling Keith Brown to speak to and move the motion. Mr Brown, you've got 13 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First of all, this Government's investment since 2007 in modernising our transport infrastructure is, I believe, transforming our strategic transport networks. I said before and would say again that I believe that Scotland's transport infrastructure has been underinvested in over decades, and we are having to try and make up for some of that lack of investment in previous decades. Of course, trying to do that at the same time as unparalleled budgetary constraints. In 6 years, 23 major improvements have been made, first of all, to our motorways and trunk roads across the length and breadth of the country, 26.5 route miles of new railway built and 6 new stations opened, the most recent being Conan Bridge in February. In addition, our investment in the strategic networks will ultimately support the low-carbon agenda by providing efficient links for public transport and the new generation of low-carbon vehicles, and that will help remove traffic from local roads to improve conditions for active travel and to encourage modal shift. And on active travel, we've added 215 miles to the network since 2007, a network which contributes £71 million a year to the Scottish economy in health savings and reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 115,000 tonnes a year. In the financial certainly I will.
Claudia Beamish. I thank the Minister for taking an intervention. As it's acknowledged that the air pollution shortens lives and transport is a major contributor, can the Minister just clarify, and I apologise if you're going to raise this in your speech, but it's in this context of climate change and air pollution. Could you explain what the Scottish Government is doing to encourage local authorities across Scotland to set up low carbon emission zones, please? Minister, and can members remember to speak through the chair, please? Minister.
Yes, I will come back to that point. I was actually covering that general area as I was speaking there, just to say that the action that we're taking in terms of the transport network also helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 115,000 tonnes. But in addition to that, for example, we've worked with Glasgow City Council in terms of low-carbon buses, hybrid buses, and also potentially retrofitting some existing buses to try and reduce the harmful emissions there, because both Glasgow and Edinburgh have issues with air quality. And over this financial year, 2013-14, we're giving Sustrans £10 million for community links and national cycle network routes. Over the next 2 years, we'll increase that by £20 million to add to the £58 million spent in this spending review period. Those different elements represent a total investment in completed schemes of more than £2 billion. But that's not the limit of our ambition. As we speak, one of the biggest investment programmes in recent times is well underway, with over £4 billion of work under construction or in procurement. And that includes, of course, the Queensferry Crossing, the largest transport infrastructure project in over a generation. Work that's creating thousands of jobs for the hard-pressed construction industry now, and building the platform Scotland needs to compete in the 21st century and secure long-term sustainable growth. Our transport networks, of course, are vital to our economy and to bringing together all communities across the country. And we are the first government to have committed to linking all of our cities by dual carriageway, a standard which is taken pretty much for granted in many modern developed countries, but apparently not in previous decades in this country. Our plans to dual the A9 between Perth and Inverness and the A96 between Inverness and Aberdeen represents an investment programme to 2030 of some £6 billion. And on our rail networks, we have a £5 billion investment programme to 2019, and that huge sum includes over £3 billion of capital investment in the rail infrastructure. We're also undertaking investment to support the operation and maintenance, of course, of the existing tracks, an investment to support substantial enhancements between Edinburgh and Glasgow, Aberdeen and Inverness and on the Highland Main Line. And together, these investments in road and rail will better connect our cities and help create growth and jobs across the country. I will do, yes.
Tavish Scott.
I'm very grateful to the Minister to give way. He mentioned the £3 billion being invested in rail in the capital investment programme. Could he identify how much of that budget is between Edinburgh and Glasgow?
Minister.
Well, the Edinburgh and Glasgow improvement project itself, of course, is currently around about £650 million, although we are looking to do some additional work in relation to that project, which might take it over that figure. And, of course, there will be other ongoing work which takes place between Edinburgh and Glasgow. And I assume what's being said or implied by Tavish Scott's question is about the amendment which he had proposed in relation to further work between Edinburgh and Glasgow on, for example, the high-speed line. But I think we are very much of the view that the existing improvements which are making to lines north of Edinburgh and Glasgow will also benefit from, for example, Egypt, which will free up capacity for points north, and also high-speed rail will also benefit the whole of Scotland if, as we expect it should do, high-speed rail comes to Scotland from London. So these completed projects are expected to generate billions in benefits over the next 30 years, and that means better journey times and reliability, improved safety, reductions in emissions and better choice, all improving the quality of life for people living and working in Scotland. And of course, business will reap the benefits too through reducing operating costs and improving access to key housing and employment sites. And we can see the benefits of this now. On rail, we have the Airdrie to Bathgate rail link and the Stirling, Allowick and Carden line, helping to give people more choice to use the train over the car. And patronage, of course, is running well above the levels initially predicted. I think in its first year, Stirling, Allowick and Carden, which was projected to have around 80,000 passengers a year, was over 400,000 passengers. Also, in relation to our roads, and we believe roads are a fundamental part of the transport infrastructure, and of course they help public transport, they help active travel as well. The new M74 through Glasgow is cutting journey times by over 15 minutes. And also in terms of the point that Claudia Beamish raised in terms of the air quality, if you think about people previously stopped for a long period of time in the mornings and the afternoons at the Kingston Bridge, who now have far better journey times and a far smoother journey, that helps to improve the air quality by having undertaken that investment. So it's vitally important for the environment as well. That also provided a much-needed catalyst for the regeneration of the East End of Glasgow. And to look to the future, Presiding Officer, the Government's infrastructure investment plan sets out our investment priorities. In the short term, it's stimulating the economy and boosting the construction sector. Construction Scotland say that for every £1 spent on construction output, a further £2.94 is generated in the economy. And the largest of these current projects, which I've mentioned, the Queensferry Crossing, has now been under construction, under the water, in fact, in many cases, for over 2 years. It's also under budget and on programme. And not only is that project securing the vital crossing across the Forth for the future, but it's currently employing around 850 people on site. 365 Scottish businesses have benefited from the project, and between them they've been awarded orders worth about £143 million to date. And that's money going straight back into the Scottish economy. Worth bearing in mind that the latest projections, of course, put the cost of that project around two-thirds of its original budget, which was between £1.75 and £2.3 billion. Current estimates around £1.4 billion. We, of course, share the frustrations of those in the Aberdeen area caused by the legal challenges in relation to the AWPR, but both that and the Balmedy to Tipperty project are now out to tender, and construction is on programme to start in the autumn next year. And when completed, that project will bring significant benefits to the North East, including around £6 billion of additional income and over 14,000 jobs over the 30 years after it opens. I will do.
Lewis MacDonald. I
very much agree and welcome the emphasis he places on the importance of the WPR. May I ask him once again about the junction of the A90, A96 to the Huddigan roundabout, a project which he has endorsed as one for the Scottish Government to do. I have not heard a good reason why that could not be brought forward and done soon. Is that a matter which he is prepared to reconsider?
Minister.
Well, rather than a good reason, I think the best thing to do is to read the report that was produced by the engineers, which said this is best done after we've completed the AWPR, not just for engineering reasons, but because if you think of the level of disruption that would be caused by undertaking that work on the Huddigan just now, it would be enormous. So I've made that response, I've not changed from that response, and I've made sure the Council is aware of that. Yes, I will.
Mark MacDonald.
Thank you very much. I wonder if the Minister would accept that Lewis MacDonald should listen to the words of his council leader, who has accepted the Scottish Government's timescale, and also perhaps it might be worth reflecting on why, when Lewis MacDonald was responsible for transport in the Scottish Executive, he did nothing to advance the Haddingen roundabout.
Minister.
I think that last point is true of many of the projects which I've mentioned. They were insufficiently progressed under previous administrations. But I'm very keen to encourage people to move from road to rail, so we can move from the AWPR to Borders Rail. On our railways, passenger journeys are up 30%. That's around 83.3 million people since the start of the franchise in 2004. And this is driving the need for investment in capacity and opportunities to improve frequency. The Borders Railway is the longest new domestic railway to be constructed in Britain for over 100 years. And that project will strengthen local communities across the Scottish borders by reintroducing a fast and efficient rail link with 7 new stations. I mentioned Egypt previously. That will also transform our railway network. Passengers will benefit from improvements in service choice and faster journey times on modern, attractive, more energy-efficient trains, as well as fully refurbished stations at Glasgow Queen Street and Haymarket, where the £27 million upgrade to that station will open to passengers next month. And the first phase of the Egypt electrification, the £80 million electrification of the Glasgow-Cumbernauld lines, will be delivered in time for the 2014 Commonwealth Games, helping people to get to the venues there. A brief one, yeah.
James Kelly.
I know you're near the end of your speech. There's been very little mention of buses. I wonder if the bus is not running this afternoon.
Minister.
Well, perhaps if James Kerr listened earlier, I mentioned him at the very start of my speech, of course. The M8 Baillieston to Newhouse motorway upgrade, it's also true to say that the buses tend to run on roads, and it's quite related, buses to roads. That's one of the reasons why we're investing in that infrastructure. M8 Baillieston to Newhouse, again, even between our 2 major cities, we don't have complete motorway there, but that is now going to be changed. We'll further improve the connections, and along with the recent M74 and the M80 upgrades, complete some of these long-standing gaps in Central Scotland's motorway network. And in terms of jobs, this project, the M8, M73, M74 project, will be of a similar scale to the M74 completion, which directly supported 900 construction jobs at its peak, with a large majority of the workers coming from the local area, and including a large number of modern apprenticeships. And I met many of those apprentices during the construction of that project. So this investment serves a critical purpose during these difficult financial times, but continued investment, of course, is still needed. So it's right that we are planning further transport projects now, laying foundations so that we can build on them tomorrow. And we all know that rail lines and roads are not built overnight. We need to do in-depth planning to make sure we deliver the right scheme at the right price, and to make sure we keep impacts on communities, businesses and the environment to an absolute minimum. And just a word on keeping down on those costs. I did meet a previous Transport Minister from this chamber once in Waverley Station, as it happened, who actually commended the government on having brought some of these projects in on price and on time. And he said, you must have to meet with these people every week. Well, that's exactly what we do. I was appalled to hear in relation to the high-speed rail debate in the House of Commons, they anticipated a 6-monthly report. In fact, they ruled out a 6-monthly report, preferring annual reports. You do really have to keep on top of these projects. But we make no apologies for taking the necessary time early on, and we need to get it right. It would be a false economy to do anything else. And too often we've seen other public infrastructure projects rushed and not properly planned, with the resulting delays and cost overruns when they get to construction. And I believe that our track record speaks for itself. The £690 million M74 completed ahead of time and under budget, the £320 million M80 on time and on budget, and it's that robust approach which we continue to intend to apply to future projects such as the A9. We've set a very demanding programme to have the 80 miles of dualling on the A9 completed by 2025, and we're on track. Last month, draft orders were published for the first stretch between Kincraig and Dalrady, and orders for the Lunkerty to Burnham section will come forward early next year. And we are the first government to commit to full dualling of the A9 between Perth and Inverness. Estimated, of course, at around £3 billion, it would represent the biggest transport infrastructure project by cost in Scotland's history. And to go back to the previous point raised by Tavish Scott, the cost of that project is in excess of the combined cost of the forced replacement crossing the M74 and the Borders Rail project. Earlier this year, I announced our outline strategy for the A96 dualling programme between Inverness and Aberdeen by 2030. That identified design and development work to be taken forward over the next few years. And I was in Mayor on Monday
come to conclusion, please.
Thanks, President Officer. The public information exhibitions. I will speak when I sum up in terms of high-speed rail as well, but just to underline the fact of the ambition that we have for the future, we have, I believe, an unparalleled record of successfully delivering critical and complex projects. And I would commend that the Parliament welcomes the record levels of investment being made made by the Scottish Government on major transport projects and agrees that these are critical in securing long-term sustainable growth and providing a modern and efficient transport system fit for the 21st century. I move the motion in my name.
Thank you. As members might have noticed, we're very short of time in this debate. I now call on Mark Griffin to speak to and move Amendment 8270.1, maximum 9 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is a very important debate, and it is a timely one, with the level of discussion, lobbying and campaigning by transport organisations and individuals who have an interest in transport infrastructure. Many of them have expressed concerns at delays, project cuts and an absence of any real transport infrastructure planning, and I hope that the recently established cross-party group on rail will be a vehicle for people to put their transport expertise to good use by informing the decision makers in that particular area. Now, the first thing that struck me when I saw the government motion was the absence of any reference to buses. That's despite a mention in the Minister's speech. That was only as a result of interventions by two of my colleagues. But the vast majority of journeys undertaken on public transport is by bus. Yet the Scottish Government support for bus services has been frozen at £53.8 million for the next 3 years, a real terms cut. Bus operators' costs are going up, and where people can actually get on a bus, fares are rising as well. Across Scotland, the picture is one of service reduction and withdrawal, closed bus depots and isolated communities. Yep.
Minister.
I wonder, given what Mark Griffin said, if he is proposing that increased expenditure should go towards buses, and if he is going to propose that during the budget process.
Mark Griffin.
I'm going to come on to a positive suggestion for the Government about how we can improve bus services across Scotland, and I genuinely hope that the Minister will take that up. But time and time again, in surgeries on the doorstep and a recent packed public meeting in Cumbernauld during the summer, people tell me that they don't believe bus companies are operating in the interest of the public, but in the interest of directors and shareholders. Public opinion in my region is that buses are not operating in the spirit of providing a public transport service, and I'm sure members in the Chamber will have had similar representations made to them in their own constituencies and region. Yep, certainly.
Mark MacDonald.
I wonder if the member would share my disappointment then that when the SNP group in Aberdeen City Council put forward a proposal for a publicly funded bus company in the city of Aberdeen, the Labour-led administration rejected it out of hand.
Mark Griffin.
I similarly hope that the member will support Ian Gray's bill on bus re-regulations, a solution for the commuters in Aberdeen to overcome those issues. And against that backdrop, I'm genuinely surprised, again, if buses are an issue, as Mark MacDonald points out, again, that there's no mention of buses in the Government's motion. And I hope the Minister will be able to clarify on just how this Government does or doesn't value buses as part of Scotland's transport infrastructure. But one constructive thing the Minister could do this afternoon is commit the Government to taking on Ian Gray's private member's bill on bus regulation. I've taken a number of interventions. I'd like to make a bit of progress first. Ian Gray's bill would give transport authorities much more power over how bus services are run, and would include a new franchising power to tender contracts for profitable and non-profitable routes together, without seeking ministers' consent or having to demonstrate market failure. Just now we have bus operators cherry-picking the most profitable routes and cutting back on quality and customer services to reduce costs, while abandoning smaller, more remote communities. Instead, we could have a strategic transport plan in regions across Scotland to make sure our bus network is fully integrated with other modes of transport like rail, park and ride and cycling facilities, and a sustainable service which connects our communities to employment and leisure opportunities. Now, we know that SNP used to support re-regulation of the bus market, and it's not too late to revisit that. And I again ask for the Government to get round the table with members who have an interest in the bus market and re-regulation in particular to see what can be delivered. Again, I'm surprised, and I state that again, that buses weren't mentioned in the motion, but there were other potential aspects of transport infrastructure which were excluded for the motion that I'm not so surprised about. In our amendment today, we've spoken about transport infrastructure fit for the 21st century and the challenges we face in achieving that. I've already mentioned bus re-regulation, and so we can look at the next challenge mentioned in the amendment, which was reducing journey times, increasing capacity and increasing the frequency of rail journeys between Scotland's cities. This particular challenge is partly addressed by the Edinburgh-Glasgow Improvement Programme, or at least it would have been if the original project was going ahead. The project has been slashed or phased, if you like, in civil service speak, and a lot of the benefits of that project have been lost. Passenger capacity may be increasing, but the increased frequency of services and the promised journey times reductions certainly won't be achieved. There are also parts of the project which would have increased capacity in the network, which have been dropped, like the Garngad Cord or the Croy Turnback facility. We also have the Dalmeny Cord, which has been cut and means that instead of trains being able to bypass the Winchborough Tunnel during electrification works, they will now be diverted via Dalmeny, increasing journey times and pushing people from rail to road. That will also cause timetabling issues for services to and from Fife and will cost taxpayers an estimated £10 million in compensation payments to the franchise holder, and that's only if Transport Scotland's initial estimate of 44 days of disruption turns out to be correct. There are question marks which still remain over the cost and benefit analysis of the revised Edinburgh-Glasgow Improvement Programme, and questions have been posed by Audit Scotland in their recent report on Scotland's key infrastructure projects. Questions about how the Minister was able to approve changes to the scope and cost of the project without an updated and improved outline business case. In that report, Audit Scotland say that they expect Transport Scotland to have had a full business case prepared and completed by May 2013. Perhaps the Minister can tell the Chamber where Transport Scotland is with that business case, and if members will be allowed to access that document and scrutinise the decision-making around the project changes. Another challenge we face in building a transport network fit for the 21st century is how we connect our major airports to our city centres, and how the lack of foresight and planning and just plain common sense by this government has made that task harder. We heard last week about how the Scottish Government was a partner in a study into the options for linking Glasgow Airport to the city centre by public transport. One of those options was a rail link, and we know that there is an interest in the private sector for developing that rail link, and that the Government is also aware of that interest since they have been working jointly with the interested party on the Airport Access Strategy document. Yet, while working with that interested party, this same Government chose to sell off the land which would make that project possible, and now we are told that the Glasgow Airport rail link is ill-conceived, a dramatic shift in policy from the Government who previously described it as desirable but not affordable. I hope that the Scottish Government will not continue with that policy and will work with the promoter of the New Garrow project and try to remove any potential barriers which might remain without taking any liability on the public purse, which just over a week ago was the Government's main objection. Presiding Officer, on this side of the Chamber, we will continue to challenge the Government on transport infrastructure, as we have done in our amendment today. We will push to make sure the Government show the ambition we really need to develop a transport network fit for the 21st century, one which serves our communities, joins up our cities and connects city centres to strategic airports, while improving connectivity, increasing active travel and reducing our carbon emissions. I move the amendment in my name. Thank you.
Many thanks. And I now call on Alex Johnson to speak to and move Amendment 8270.36 minutes.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. It remains an eternal source of embarrassment to the politicians who were responsible that between 1997 and 2007 there was a hiatus in construction on our trunk road network. And it wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate act of policy that first a Labour government, then a coalition government here in the Scottish Parliament decided to prioritise other things. The road building programme, which had seen substantial developments in our trunk road network, waited for 10 years. And when the current government came to power first as a minority, back in 2007, it was they who put roads back on the agenda. For that reason, I have told the Minister many times that there is little I can criticise about his road-building programme, and I will rightfully continue to praise that change in policy. However, it has to be said that that alone doesn't constitute the modernising of Scotland's transport infrastructure for the 21st century, and there's still much that we have to discuss and agree on. First of all, if we look at that roads building programme, I still believe that there is one glaring omission from the priorities that have been identified by this government, and that is, while linking Scotland's cities with dual carriageways or motorways, it also remains a priority for me to ensure that we complete our connections to the rest of the United Kingdom. And I believe that, in spite of the fact that there are differences of opinion on either side of the border, that it should be a priority of our government and our Transport Minister to forge links with his counterparts south of the border that will see the upgrading of the A1 to become part of an East Coast motorway network, because Edinburgh and the east of Scotland have a great deal to gain from being linked to the north east of England. Similarly, it has to be said that this government has failed to address the issue of accident black spots, which are always on the minds of MSPs. And it remains a surprise to me that this government and this minister will not act to deal with the problems surrounding the junction with the A90 and the A937 at Lawrence Kirk. The pronouncements that we've seen from Transport Scotland in recent months can only make me think that there are none so blind as those who will not see. However, if we look on at the other priorities that this government have raised and that the Minister has raised in his opening speech, there is, of course, the issue of buses, which again was raised by the Labour Party. And I have supported the changes that have been made to the Bus Service Operators Grant. I believe these are constructive and positive, but I believe they're underfunded. And as a consequence, many of the problems described by the Labour Party and used as an excuse for re-regulation are in fact caused by changes in that funding level. And that brings me to the amendment proposed by the Labour Party. There is a list in the amendment of wholesome projects and priorities that we should all consider in the longer term. But the determination to pursue the concept of centralised planning and the re-regulation of our bus industry are enough to frighten off a poor innocent Tory like me. I believe that we should be working constructively with the bus companies we have here in Scotland. And let's face it, that it was deregulation that created the business opportunity for companies like Stagecoach and First Group, two of the biggest transport groups in Europe, to get in there and become the successful businesses that they are. Let's praise these companies and not make the mistake of condemning them by attacking the regulatory system, or lack of it, as we currently have. But I also, as I mentioned, am worried that this motion we have before us today is not a plan for modernising our transport infrastructure in its entirety. First of all, as I say in my amendment, it does give the lie to the idea put about by John Swinney and others that somehow there is a huge lack in capital investment. In these difficult times, it seems rather clear that, since they choose to mention £4 billion of expenditure in their motion, that the government are quite clearly able to find investment resources for priorities when they come along. But the other great project that's been discussed across Britain as a whole is the idea of high-speed rail. And there are many in this chamber, including the government itself, who have bought into the idea of a high-speed rail network. Now, we've reached an absolutely critical phase in that.
Final minute.
If this project is to go ahead, then we must now understand how it will develop, what it might cost, and how that cost will be broken down between Scotland and England in the future. Now, if the Minister gets his way and Scotland becomes an independent country, I can't see why a UK government would wish to extend the high-speed rail network any further north than Manchester or Leeds. If Scotland becomes an independent country, we need some explanation as to how Scotland will benefit from that, beyond simply being able to access that rail network by trains. If this government believes that high-speed rail can come to central Scotland and deliver benefits to places like Aberdeen and Inverness, we need some explanation as to how they will pay their share.
I'm afraid you must finish.
Because never has there been a project that looks to me more like one for the United Kingdom. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. Opening up the debate, I have to advise members that we're extremely short of time, and therefore, although it was indicated speeches would be 6 minutes, if members could take around 5 minutes, I might be able to call everyone who's indicated that they want to take part in the debate. Otherwise, I'm afraid I will not be able to. I call Chick Brodie to be followed by Lewis MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted, of course, to support the motion. Listening to Alec Johnson, and he's such a nice fellow, and reading his motion, not what he said, I'm reminded of the adage that once you get rid of objectivity, sense and clarity, the rest is a piece of cake. And his motion's evocation at the level of investment, as you just expounded, shows that our government's assertion about the lack of a significant capital budget are unfounded. Suggests that he has an amnesia, because we have to spend on other areas like health and education. Of course, he welcomes, as he would welcome, the UK government's commitment to modernise transport, as evidenced by the commitment to high-speed rail, which welcome, of course, may be understood if you live in Leeds or south of Leeds. And his statement about who pays for it, well, does he not think that Scotland already pays a disproportionate part of its taxes to the UK revenue? But I do welcome the Minister's efforts to take HS2 beyond Leeds and Manchester to Scotland. Presiding Officer, it's easy to applaud our Minister because he's our Minister. But that is not the reason. It's because he has done a generally and widely accepted great job in carving out of a minimal capital resource budget project deliverables across that spectrum of reduced spend, whether it be the Queen's Ferry Crossing, which incidentally was endorsed by Audit Scotland as being of sound management, on target and on budget. It tells me he only achieved that success indeed through good and sound management, involvement and practice. And let me, Presiding Officer, if I may, turn to some of the achievements and the opportunities in the south of Scotland. Firstly, the Borders Railway, which the Minister mentioned, which in 1849, as the Waverley Line, ran from Edinburgh through the Borders and was later extended to Carlisle. The Beeching Report, of course, axed it, along with many others, in 1969. Now, not for 30 years was the reopening even considered, and I pay tribute to the Scottish Government of the time and the campaigners for Borders Railway, who ensured that this rural border phoenix would rise again. This re-establishment of an important rail link will open up and reconnect the border communities with each other, with the nation's capital, and in so doing will make its contribution to climate change targets. And that rail link is not just about that. It's about delivering £33 million of economic benefits that flow from its construction, and more importantly, it will, as I said, open up the borders to deliver much more social, economic and environmental benefits. And who knows that with more control over our own spending in the years to come, extension of that line to Carlisle with spurs to Stranraer, for example, will open up fully the South West and restore the line to what it once was. May I also, Presiding Officer, say in passing, in the dealings that I've had with the likes of Network Rail and ScotRail, that I've been very impressed by the professionalism. But it's not just rail strategy, it's the futuristic interconnectivity of our airports, our ports, our rails and roads that will drive our sustainable development and economic growth targets as we go forward. And of course, I would applaud the decision to buy Prestwick Airport, but it's not just about that airport and its confidence to support the other airports on maintenance, repair, overhaul and cargo, but for it to work as part of an aviation framework going forward for the 21st century, colluding with island airports and being part of that aviation framework that will see, hopefully, worldwide direct flights and communications to and from Scotland. And who knows, with its unique runway capabilities, Prestwick could see future intergalactic and space flights. But that is a matter for current and ongoing current conversations.
Final minute.
But what is much more immediate is the possibility to link all of our transport infrastructure with our tourism and export possibilities. For example, it is unacceptable that Scotland hosts 50 cruise ships per year, whereas Copenhagen hosts 500. Development of ports is critical, which is why I would like to see, for example, deep dredging of Troon and Ayr harbours to develop a partnership, as I mentioned, with my favourite airport. The same equally could apply with Edinburgh and Leith and Cockenzie, for example. And additionally and briefly, Presiding Officer, to pool exports from the north of England for worldwide distribution from east and west of Scotland, ports and airports would at one stroke reduce carbon emissions, costs, time and expand our huge export capabilities. And integrated and efficient physical connectivity related to our broadband ambitions can and will make us truly fit for the 21st century.
Many thanks. And I now call Lewis MacDonald to be followed by Fiona MacLeod.
In meeting the transport challenges of the 21st century, the question is always which ones to meet first. Connectivity for the Aberdeen City region should be a very high priority for governments in both Edinburgh and London. Few places contribute more per head of population to either the Scottish or the UK economy. The City of Aberdeen is the first council to raise more for the Scottish Government in business rates than it receives in government grants. The oil and gas industry, largely based in the North East, contributes a quarter of all corporation taxes in the UK and accounts for billions of pounds in export earnings. Barriers to economic growth in Aberdeen are bad news for the whole country, and reducing those barriers should be a top priority for government at every level. 3 weeks ago, we learned an uncomfortable truth about the potential economic impact of HS2, a major project with cross-party support both here and at Westminster. The UK Government had asked KPMG to calculate the impact of HS2 on city regions across the country, including those which would lose out as a result of other regions becoming better connected with London and with each other by high-speed rail. KPMG concluded that the Aberdeen City region could be the hardest hit in the UK, with a reduced economic output of as much as £220 million a year. But HS2 doesn't have to be bad news for Aberdeen any more than for Scotland as a whole. There are things that both the Scottish and the UK governments can do to mitigate the displacement effect, which will apply not just to Aberdeen but to other places in the country such as Bristol and Cambridge as well, but to mitigate the displacement effect by ensuring that Aberdeen becomes better connected both to London and to the northern end of the high-speed network.
Maureen Watt.
I thank the member for giving way. Will the member concede that that was probably a desktop exercise done by KPMG which didn't take into account the oil and gas sector in Aberdeen and the North East?
Lewis MacDonald.
Well, I have looked very closely at the methodology in as far as it's been published, and very little of it has been published. I think the important point to make in response to Maureen Watt is to remind her that the second largest concentration of oil and gas jobs in the UK is not in Shetland or the Moray Firth, it's in Greater London. And so we should not assume that oil and gas jobs cannot be displaced to elsewhere in the United Kingdom. But top of the list of the mitigating measures that the Scottish Government can take should be cutting journey times on the intercity routes between Aberdeen and the Central Belt. Ministers identified ways of doing that in their Strategic Transport Projects Review in 2008, removing the one short stretch of single track at Montrose and building a new line from Inverkeithing to Holbeath, with a view ultimately to linking up the Aberdeen-Edinburgh and Aberdeen-Glasgow lines at Perth. Those options were flagged up, but they have not been given the green light. I raised the absence of the Holbeath project from the National Planning Framework as long ago as the Economic Committee's consideration of NPF2 in 2009, but there is still no firm commitment from Government to any of those projects as we move towards NPF3. Top of the list for the UK Government, and of vital importance to the Scottish economy, is to maintain and strengthen the air links between Aberdeen and London. HS2 will make many domestic air routes redundant, not just between London and other English cities, but perhaps ultimately between London and Glasgow and Edinburgh too. But high-speed rail can never substitute for air travel between the north of Scotland and London, simply because of the sheer distances involved. More passengers fly from Aberdeen to Heathrow every year than to the hub airports at Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Paris, Copenhagen and Dublin put together. it is by far the most important destination for the Aberdeen economy. And that is why the North East Transport Partnership, Nestrans, has called this week for guaranteed access for Aberdeen flights to landing slots at Heathrow and for such slots to be written in to any future development there.
Final minute.
It is open to the UK Government to protect those slots, especially as the European Union is currently reviewing its landing slots regulations. Under current rules, it would not be possible in the event of Scottish independence, since Aberdeen and London Heathrow would then be in separate countries. But it is in the UK's interest, as well as Scotland's, to protect Aberdeen's international competitiveness. If Scottish ministers want to help Aberdeen's economy, there are things they can do with the powers they already have. They can confirm that expansion of Aberdeen Harbour is a national priority by giving a fair wind to those plans, and the TV celebrities at the Crown and Anchor would expect no less. They could help fund a feasibility study into a light rail link from Aberdeen International Airport to the city centre, as the City Council have invited them to do. And they could look again at the Stag report in the Huddigan, and they would find there is no reason not to progress with that. Taking those steps and mitigating the impact of HS2 would show that ministers understood that Aberdeen's transport needs go beyond the WPR, and they would also show that they understood that investing in Aberdeen's transport infrastructure is not an optional extra. It is essential to the future success of Scotland as a whole.
Many thanks. I call Fiona MacLeod to be followed by Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's interesting that in this debate on transport infrastructure for the 21st century, so far almost everybody has referred to motorised transport, although I know in the opening remarks the Minister did talk about the money going towards the National Cycle Network. But I do want to talk very much about delivering safe streets for cyclists and pedestrians, because I believe that that is intrinsic to a 21st century transport infrastructure. And it is talking about shared space for different modes of transport, and it is about equality of access to that space and prioritising who gets that access to the space. And I want to be very clear in this short contribution to the debate that talking about cycling and walking as a mode of transport is not fanciful and is not sort of Fiona going back to our hippie roots, but it is incredibly practical. This is about, amongst other things, climate change, as the Minister talked about in his opening remarks. And in order to address climate change, we need to effect behaviour change and modal shift. And modal shift used to be very much talking about getting out your cars and get on the bus or the train. But we really need to increasingly talk about get out of your motorised transport and get on your feet or on your bike. But one of the big behaviour changes we have to make, or sort of the shifts that we have to make, is to convince the public that they've got this false sense of security that if they're in their car, they as an individual person are safer than they are on a bike or out walking. And this is especially the case with parents and asking them to get their kids to walk or cycle to school. It's this false sense of security about the car. And so it's about how do we make that change to shared space, but shared space equals safe space for all the users of that area. And I'm very proud of two of my colleagues in Parliament this time, Sandra White and Dennis Robertson, with their members' bills on responsible parking and on the use of the blue badge, because that is getting us to think about how we all share the space and use the space of the streets that we live in. But from my own constituency, I wanted to actually talk about something much bolder, much broader, a huge attitude shift. In Bishopbriggs, in my constituency, there is a strong lobby of people wanting to see Bishopbriggs as the first 20-mile-per-hour town in the whole of Scotland. Not a zone, not a limit, but a 20-mile-per-hour town. And we've got some fantastic campaigners working on this. And in the chamber, I've often referred to Eastern Bartonshire Cycle Co-op, which has achieved the amazing number of 20% of primary schoolers in Bishopbriggs cycle to school every day. That's really quite something to achieve, and that's without a 20-mile-per-hour town. But they're talking about how do they get the parents of the other 80% to believe that it's safe to let their children walk or cycle to school. And I'm absolutely delighted that in the Climate Challenge Fund, we've just at Eastern Bartonshire Cycle Co-op just received £160,000 to work towards the project called Good Moves Bishop Briggs. So, you know, this is a group of people that know what they're doing, that are already affecting change, but in getting 20 miles per hour as the accepted limit throughout the whole town, they've been defeated. And I have to get a bit technical here, members, presiding officer and minister.
Final minute.
I think it's fair to say that the guidance for setting 20 miles per hour limits can be confusing and requires much cross-referencing across a number of documents and traffic regulations. With 55 seconds, I couldn't possibly list all the pieces of legislation you have to look at. But what it comes down to is about focusing on whether you need to have physical or psychological calming. Is that necessary in order to have 20 mile per hour zones? And in paragraph 5 of the SEDD circular number 6, 2001, states that it's for local traffic authorities to decide on the number and different type of traffic calming measures which should be employed in each particular case. But the problem in Bishop Briggs is that we can't convince, through all these different pieces of legislation, Eastern Bartonshire Council just keeps saying, we can't do it, it's not possible, the regulations don't let us. But in CAPS 2013, it clearly says that we want more 20 mile per hour zones. In Bishop Briggs, we want a 20 mile per hour town. So can I finish, Minister, by saying, is there some way we can simplify the regulations, make the guidance clearer so that we can stop buck passing and actually achieve that modal shift to safe shared space? Thank you.
Many thanks. And I call Tavish Scott to be followed by Jemmy Eadie.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. When Sarah Boyack became the first Transport Minister under devolution, she did not inherit, Mr Johnson, a transport policy. She inherited a roads policy, because that was the nature of transport policy at the time. The previous governments responsible for transport policy in London left this Parliament a roads policy. And I was very supportive, and still am, of governments that move the spending in a much more balanced way to address, I think as Fiona MacLeod has rightly just recognised, the importance of other forms of transport, including, yes, cycling and using our own feet, but principally to bus and to rail. And I don't think that's a wrong approach at all. I disagree quite profoundly with, and I did from 1999 onwards, with Alec Johnson and the Tories on this, although it was muddy tosh at that time, and do to this day. I think Keith Brown's got this in this sense, broadly right. But I hope he, as a minister, would recognise that, just as I used to get these things quoted at me as well, when organisations like Transform Scotland write, as they have for this debate this afternoon, that the government's own transport indicators demonstrate that its policies has failed to move people onto public transport, failed to reduce congestion and led to an increase in climate emissions, then we've all got some greater challenges to recognise. That, I think, has to be any government's objective, to look at the balance of spending between as some have called it, motorised transport, but road and rail, and how best to achieve the greatest impact for moving our greatest number of citizens in the ways in which they wish to be moved. Now, I have some sympathy for the Minister as well on bus regulation, not least because Lewis MacDonald will remember this well. I resisted that at the time. I wasn't particularly popular in the Labour group for resisting it in the time, but I was telling you I was an awful lot more unpopular with the SNP, because at that time it was Glasgow members like Sandra White and Nicola Sturgeon who led the charge on bus re-regulation. Now, it's for the Minister, of course, to sort out his policy today and for his government to decide what they want to do on Ian Gray's bill. But there may indeed be some merit in some of the proposals that Mr Gray has brought forward. And if I could just suggest that that bill should at least get the proper kind of parliamentary hearing that a measure addressing a fundamental issue deserves, then that at least would recognise the nature of that particular problem. I don't accept and won't that we can have a year year zero approach to what happened before 2007. The Lark-Holmel-Guy rail line opened in 2005. That was the first line to open in 25 years, and that's a considerable tribute to the promoters of that particular line and also to all who were involved at that time. But it's not fair to say, and I don't suppose Keith Brown really believes this, I know we have to do politics, but I don't suppose he really believes this, that nothing happened on rail before 2007. There are an awful lot of good projects that came forward, and there was a good example of an actual project, of course I'll give way, a project that actually happened.
No, that's not my position. I did make the point, I think there had been a lack of investment for many decades, but there were undoubtedly some initiatives. The one that we, as a council, proposed from Clipmanager and Stirling and Albion Carden, well supported by the Scottish Executive at that time. I do acknowledge that.
Tavish Scott.
I'll try and keep that consensual tone going, as I do accept that. And I did want to make a particular mention of those organisations, such as Mr Brown's own council at that time, who played a very important part in moving that forward and will in the future. I just wanted to make really 2 points around journey times, as a number of members have mentioned, because I do think that is the fundamental issue that the Minister will have to address when he looks at the new approach to the tendering of the ScotRail franchise. He announced just the other day the Transport Scotland, I suppose, announced the shortlist for those who will bid for running our rail services across Scotland. I think journey times are the fundamental issue which help the competitiveness of rail versus road. We have all got those examples, and Lewis McDonald rightly mentioned them in the context of Aberdeen and the North East, a road I drive a lot as I drive the A9 too.
Final minute.
Inverness to Edinburgh or indeed to Glasgow is not competitive by rail at the moment in comparison to car or indeed to bus, as I put my son on that bus journey a lot. And that is where I believe the future investment has to look very closely at not just on capacity on these routes, on rail routes, but actually on journey times. And that's where I would encourage the Minister to address his thoughts and his budget. It's not just about dualling major pieces of trunk infrastructure, much as I appreciate that politically that's a very attractive thing to do. But if we do not make and cut journey times between our major cities across Scotland, actually the balance of spending won't matter, because we will not encourage people to shift from, as I think all members would hope, or certainly most of our members would hope, from road, and give them the option of really good public transport systems that can also get them from, for example, Aberdeen to Edinburgh.
Many thanks. I now call Jim Eadie to be followed by Ken McIntosh.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've had an interesting whirlwind tour this afternoon, which began with the Huggardin roundabout from Lewis MacDonald, moved on to making Bishop Briggs a 20-mile-per-hour town from Fiona MacLeod. We then had an interesting and memorable contribution from Chick Brodie when he talked about intergalactic travel. And then we had the valuable history lesson from Tavish Scott retelling us about the significant transport decisions since the inception of devolution, and they say that transport infrastructure is boring. I think we all realise that transport infrastructure is in fact vital to the function of Scotland's economy, as well as connecting communities across the country. But there is always a debate to be had about how we balance competing transport priorities within the budget that is available. But there is no doubt that if Scotland is to cement its future as a modern, sustainable economy and society, we must ensure that we have an integrated transport network that is truly fit for purpose. One that will allow us to maximise Scotland's opportunities for commerce, leisure and tourism, and to unlock our full potential. Most of all, it is essential in our transition, as we've already heard this afternoon, in becoming a low-carbon economy. Well-functioning transport infrastructure can bring about the modal shift, as we've also heard, as we move from the car to alternative forms of transport, be they active travel by walking and cycling, public transport such as green buses and rail, or other forms of sustainable transport such as electric cars and car share schemes. And securing a transport infrastructure that is fit for purpose requires not only focus and insight to meet the challenges head-on, but the vision to look ahead at our future needs and the discipline to manage those decisions effectively. And I think that the Minister for Transport and Veterans has certainly risen to the challenge. The Queensferry crossing is a major capital investment, but it is necessary to safeguard a vital connection to Scotland's transport network, currently under budget and on programme. That crossing will add an additional economic benefit to Scotland in the region of £6 billion, and it is reassuring that the project's management has been commended by Audit Scotland. The existing Forth Road Bridge will continue to operate, but as a public transport corridor, for the benefit of cyclists, pedestrians and those who use public transport. That is a good example that we wish to set, but it is not the only example. We heard also this afternoon about the commitment to inject £3 billion into Scotland's railways in the next 5-year period, with £3 billion of investment in rail infrastructure. An additional £1 billion of government-backed industry investment in strategic network enhancements, a further funding of £1 billion over 5 years for ScotRail and the Caledonian Sleeper. More rigorous standards for train performance and a dedicated franchise to secure the future of the sleeper service. Network Rail will be required to oversee the delivery of the Egypt project and the reopening of the Borders Railway. The first phase of improvements across the Aberdeen to Inverness corridor, phase 2 of improvements to the Highland Main Line and the development of a rolling programme of electrification following the completion of Egypt. I defy anyone to suggest that this is anything other than significant infrastructure investment in our railways. This investment forms part of the largest and most substantial transport investment programme that Scotland has ever seen, and the Scottish Government deserves credit for it. But the goal that we must work towards is to secure a fully integrated transport network, and this means improving connections across the country, ensuring that the rail timetable is synchronised with local buses and ferries, and that the necessary infrastructure is in place to connect up train and cycle journeys. And I agree wholeheartedly with my colleague Fiona MacLeod when she said that cycling is not an afterthought, nor an add-on, but should be an integral part of our transport strategy. City Cycling Edinburgh Forum and Spokes have both highlighted in advance of today's debate the importance of cycling as a mode of local transport, as well as a means of achieving our shared objectives on congestion, carbon emissions and public health. It's why the Scottish Cycle Network is so important, and it's why we have to learn the lessons from other European countries and cities and from our English neighbours as they embark on urban cycle networks in their cities. I like the idea from Fiona MacLeod of having a 20-mile-per-hour town, and it echoes to some extent the call from Spokes to have at least one cycle-friendly town or city in each Scottish local authority. I'm glad that the City of Edinburgh Council has made good its pledge and its commitment to fund active travel to the tune of 5%. That's rising to 6% and will rise further in the coming years. I'm glad that the Government released £3.9 million investment into shovel-ready projects for cycling, and that £300,000 of that has already gone to resurface North Meadow Walk for the benefit of my constituents and those in the neighbouring constituency of Edinburgh Central. I'm delighted at the additional funding of £20 million over 2 years and the leveraging in of additional funding from local authorities, which will bring that figure to £35 million. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, a focus on integrated infrastructure and sustainable travel will help Scotland to achieve the sustainable transport future that I believe that we all across this chamber wish to see.
Many thanks. Many thanks. Now calling Ken McIntosh to be followed by Rob Gibson. Up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thought that was an excellent and thoughtful contribution from Jim Eadie, which I'm very grateful for, because I do sometimes worry for the Scottish Government and their need not just to suppress all criticism, but to constantly seek praise, even if it is just today from their own backbenchers, and I believe Alec Johnson too. Patting yourself on the back for roads which haven't been built strikes me as odd, when surely it's Parliament's job to scrutinise these very decisions and question their value for money, their benefit to Scotland. This could, or even should be, a consensual debate. After all, Labour and the SNP share a Keynesian approach to the economy, keen to invest in infrastructure projects, both of us rejecting the Conservative-led UK Government's approach that has kept us in the doldrums for 4 years. But once we move beyond the macro economy at the strategic level, there are serious questions which need to be answered by the Scottish Government about the detail of their infrastructure programme. Now, the Minister might not recognise that his motion has a hollow ring to it, but there are no shortages of other, dare I say, more objective observers to offer a more balanced perspective. The Queensferry Crossing, for example, received overwhelming support from this Parliament and still does. But as the Jimmy Reid Foundation, the Community Trade Union, the STUC and many others have highlighted, are we not to be concerned at the manner in which the contracts for steel, cement and construction went abroad rather than to local companies? It's right to highlight the Borders Railway, but surely in a debate on Scotland's strategic transport infrastructure, it would be simply wrong not to talk about the importance of rail links to our main airports. And concerns or questions about whether or not projects are on time or on budget are certainly not just being raised by opposition parties. Let me quote directly from the Auditor General, who recently reported on our key transport infrastructure projects. And this is a quote, "The Scottish Government considers its spending on 5 key infrastructure projects affordable in the long term, but it has not demonstrated the reliability of its analysis in this area." And again, "Reporting of the building costs for 3 projects has also been incomplete or inconsistently presented. The timescale for completion of the Edinburgh-Glasgow Improvement Programme has increased by over 2 years. For the Borders Railway and the Edinburgh-Glasgow Improvement projects, Transport Scotland did not ensure that business cases were complete and up to date at all stages. Consequently, at certain decision points, it had not fully demonstrated the viability, value for money and affordability of the projects." These are hardly observations, Presiding Officer, which fill you with confidence in the competence of this administration. A worry, I may add, that was compounded when the Permanent Secretary, and that's the Scottish Government's chief civil servant, when the Permanent Secretary had to apologise to the Parliament's Audit Committee for failing to disclose £500 million that this Government is spending on these very projects. The Permanent Secretary's excuse, by the way, was that the Scottish Government's figures didn't include the costs of purchasing the land necessary for these infrastructure projects to go ahead. Presiding Officer, this administration seems to have a very strange attitude to land purchases. As we know from the Glasgow Airport rail link, they're happy to pay hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds to buy land, but think nothing of scrapping whole projects and then selling it off again for the tiniest fraction of its cost. Now we know. They don't even want to declare these purchases to the Parliament's Audit Committee. You wouldn't have to wonder why. Presiding Officer, the Minister seems to think that we should simply applaud his list of as yet unbuilt roads. But when you look in more detail at the transport infrastructure projects, rather than being reassured, this Government's lack of transparency over costs and its failure to provide information on affordability raises even more questions. Today's motion talks about more than £4 billion worth of work, but the Auditor-General has estimated that this SNP administration is committing us to £7.5 billion of spending over the next 30 years from the 5 big transport projects alone. She further highlights that for 4 of those revenue finance projects, more than £5 billion of the estimated committed costs have not been reported publicly by the Scottish Government. We are supposed to be reassured instead by the Finance Secretary's intention, outlined in admittedly slightly more detail in this year's budget statement, to limit future revenue finance investment, that's PFI, PPP or NPD projects for the rest of us, to less than 5% of its expected future annual budget. But the Scottish Government have not told us, for example, why they've set the level at 5%. What we do know is that repayments will be from the resource budget alone, but in calculating the 5% cap, the capital budget is also included, as is the non-cash departmental expenditure limit, and also included is the local government allocation, despite the fact that the local government share of future revenue commitments is excluded. That's some way to calculate 5%, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks, and thanks for sticking to your time. Now call on Rob Gibson to be followed by Cameron Buchanan. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. KPMG, Scotland Business Instinct Survey, has shown that energy, tourism and food and drink sectors will contribute the most positive impact to the Scottish economy in the next 10 years. I would suggest that that doesn't just mean in Glasgow and Edinburgh and Aberdeen. It does mean across the country, and indeed I'm looking for an all-Scotland policy and would want to look at some of the issues that are being raised by this government positively to help us to do that, but also to raise other matters of some concern. To start off with, of course, people need to have choices, and the choices are not necessarily to go faster, but to be reliable, to recognise that distance is one of the issues which we have to deal with, and indeed, if it's going to be some way in future that's sustainable, then it has to be low carbon, and therefore it has to include trains, for example, rather than encouraging people to travel long journeys by road. But just on the road question for a start, on dualling the A9 south of Inverness, I wonder if the Minister could give us an idea of how the interim process of the average speed cameras will work, given that the average speeds will be higher than they are on the A77, because people are looking for some help on that to understand how it will work. But looking further north into my own constituency, we can see from climate change terms that various issues crop up. Extreme flooding has led to the need for a £1 million 30-week project on the A9 at the Port Gower Mill Culvert Bridge, beside the house of a friend of mine, Margot McGregor, who's got a massive building site outside her windows, but it makes a change from the water from that burn being up to her kitchen window and frightening the life out of her. But it's an extra added piece of work which is necessary, and there are no other easy routes to the north. It is the main road, and there are massive detours. So we're very pleased that these kinds of £1 million projects, which have to be slotted in, have been, and that's welcome. I would also mention that after 40 years of talking about the Berrydale Braes on the A9 into Caithness, that this is perhaps the only alpine section of Trunk Road in Scotland. It's very difficult to deal with. We've made progress in the last 3 years through the stages with the help of the local estate, which has come up with a simple plan, not a massive flyover, which we couldn't afford, and indeed working with the Nuclear Decommissioning Agency, Scottish Government, Hightrans and the Highland Council, getting to the stage of the technical survey being done now, and indeed delivering, hopefully, on the shovel-ready project in the near future. These are items which help long communication lines in Scotland to get access to the main road networks, and it's important to see these as things that we need to happen soon. Briefly, because of the time, I have to mention rail services. We are glad about the Conan Bridge station opening. There are others that could do in the North Line. However, we need better rolling stock. We need access to electric plugs that there are on electric trains in the Glasgow and west of Scotland area for long journeys, so that we can get our computers plugged in, so that we can get proper broadband, because it is appalling on the journey between Perth and Inverness or further north to get any kind of broadband at all. I would say that the potential for freight traffic on the rail is exemplified by the whisky trains that are now going to go from Elgin via Aberdeen and take 29 lorries off the A9 every time one of these trains goes. That's a great innovation. So the freight delivery grants have got to be rolled out to other things. And since DRS is removing nuclear waste by rail, let's hope we can get that rolling stock used to bring things up to Caithness on the return journey. We should say also that there's an issue in terms of Flybe. I'm very concerning about their cuts in staff. We are at the end of the line, but the regional airlines which we serve our lifeline services to Wick in my constituency and to the islands is a very important part of our infrastructure, and we'd like the Minister to take great care to make sure that these continue, because I heard a correspondent on the radio talking about some people having public service obligations. Very few of these are public service obligations, and it's very important that we get many of these things in a line if we're going to see integrated transport to the far north in the future. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
And thank you very much. Now Colin Cameron Buchanan, to be followed by Maureen Watt. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Members have already raised a varied number of important points, but I would like to focus my comments today on one of the two aspects of our future strategy. The Government's motion is very much focused on the investment that has been made in our transport infrastructure. However, as welcome as our investment in our transport infrastructure is, it must be matched by a comprehensive and joined-up strategy in order to drive sustainable economic growth. It must also be a strategy which is focused on the commuter. It has been some time since the Scottish Government's last National Transport Strategy was launched, I think in 2006, and one of the key aims of that strategy was the improvement of journey times and connections. This was welcome, and undoubtedly improvements have been made as a result. However, there are clear weaknesses. It was noted that the Edinburgh Gateway tram and rail interchange at Goga represented a missed opportunity of the park and ride facility. Similarly, at the newly opened Bathgate Airdrie rail link, it has led to a significant increase in traffic at Bathgate train station. Indeed, even though the station is only 3 years old, it already appears as though the parking capacity is insufficient. This just goes to show how important it is to think through the applications of future infrastructure spending. Now, I'm no great fan of management buzzwords, but nonetheless, we do need a joined-up approach to transport planning. The approach of improving connections in the existing government strategy is far too narrow, and there's a need for a more comprehensive, individually focused plan. We need to start with the basics. Who's travelling? Where are they going? How do they want to get there? What's stopping them from doing what they want to do, or how can we make it easier? We need to know not only who's using the train, but who isn't using the train and why. How are they getting to the station? Are there people who would take their bike if facilities and bicycle routes were safer? All these questions need to be asked. The commuter must, I think, be at the centre of any joined-up transport strategy. The entirety of their journey from door to door must be understood, and what can be done to make it quicker and easier. It's my feeling, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, that there will be a good deal of easy improvements we can make at a relatively low cost. Large-scale investment in infrastructure is not the only route to improvement. Future transport needs, as well as the present demands, should also be about shaping policy. Rail Future Scotland is already lobbying for the restoration of double track on heavily used and high-frequency routes, such as the recently extended Milngavie line. I was also interested to note in the recent comments of Paul Tetlaw of Transform Scotland, who described the Highland Main Line as a slimmed-down Victorian railway, and called for the twin tracking of the route and electrification. And I think this was a personal commitment of the First Minister at the last election. This raises questions about whether we are for future-proofing existing infrastructure projects, such as the Borders Rail Link, of which only 3 stretches are twin-tracked. The Campaign for Borders Rail and Transform Scotland has already criticised the proposed construction of the bridges, which are only suitable for single track on the rail line, rightly questioning the consequences for overall capacity in the future. We must avoid the situation where we build infrastructure which within a few years is at capacity and there's a need for costly investment and improvement. Obviously, we can't peer into the future and we don't have inexhaustible resources, but we must be looking to deliver the best possible value for the taxpayer that won't be achieved by building infrastructure with a limited fit-for-purpose lifespan. In some ways, this is one of the biggest challenges of the planning transport infrastructure, making sure it fits our future needs rather than our existing needs. I think it is also important to accept that the Scottish Government cannot deliver a comprehensive transport strategy on its own, but needs to work with local authorities in its planning and delivery. Resources must be directed to according to local priorities, according to local councils, and should not be dictated by central government. In this context, it is important to keep a close eye on what the local authorities are doing with the money available to them through things like cycling, walking and safer street budgets. We must accept that it is for the local authorities to decide on where their transport priorities lie, and do not attempt to peddle in ring fences by the back door. That said, there are local authorities where cycling is a priority, and in Edinburgh there's a need to make it safer and easier to get around the city. I welcome the steps that have already been taken. As a keen cyclist, although, as you may have noticed, not as much recently as you may imagine, I support this area. My extensive travels to Europe on business, I've seen the sort of facilities and initiatives that can be used to encourage safer cycling. I regret to say, Presiding Officer, that so many other forms of physical exercise, they do it on the continent with much more style. The biggest barrier to cycling there seems to be the perception of it being dangerous, which is almost certainly the result of recent high-profile fatalities. That's why we need to think a good deal more about how we offer a safe environment for cyclists. I was interested to note last week that London's Mayor Boris Johnson launched a new stretch of London's cycle superhighway, which is fully segregated from other traffic. Segregated cycle lanes have already been called for with the cycling campaign.
You must draw to a close, please.
And it's one of the ideas that we should be fully considering. We must ensure that funding is available to put to the best possible use. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call on Maureen Watt to be followed by Mary Fee.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am pleased to be taking part in this debate and towards the end of it because, as Convener of Infrastructure and Capital Investment, it's been very interesting to hear views from across the Chamber on this matter, which of course occupies much of our time in committee. Presiding Officer, what strikes me most about the current government's infrastructure investment compared to that of previous governments is that it's for the whole of Scotland. It is the first government which has as a priority to connect all our cities with dual carriageways, and the effect of this cannot be underestimated. It will be a key factor in convincing people that they're able to still live in rural towns and villages, many of which are not on rail routes, but yet be able to get access to employment further afield. And that I'm pleased that these projects are progressing well and that the consultations, for example, as the Minister mentioned, on communities along the A96 are currently taking place. I really have to take issue with those who complain and oppose the dualling of these roads, which I think are taken from very much a central belt perspective, which is already well served by a network of motorways and dual carriageways. Those who are against improvement of the road network to and in the north and north east clearly are not subject to the daily frustration that my and other colleagues' constituents face as they try to go about their daily lives. And those who are concerned about air pollution are failing to take into account the increase in cars which now have very low emissions, and although still in its infancy, the number of electric vehicles which is increasing. I'm pleased that the Minister mentioned the AWPR. In a survey conducted by Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce this spring, 87% of respondents identified the AWPR as the key infrastructure investment which will drive economic growth in the region. And we have already seen the unlocking of many large-scale developments in the region because of the progress which is at last being made on this vital project. Some of the briefings that we've received for this debate have complained that more investment is going into roads rather than rail. But whether it be transport economists or those involved in the rail industry itself, they will tell you that investment in rail has never been higher hasn't been higher in Scotland for years, and that the other parts of the UK are envious of the Scottish Government's commitment to rail. £4 billion of spend since 2007, supporting new rail lines, new and better services, new stations and new trains. 83 million passenger journeys in Scotland, which is a 33% increase since 2004. Rail freight continues to grow, and it is pleasing to watch the latest moves to rail of that most valuable of freight, whisky from Murray. Apart from Alec Johnson and the Tories, I'm sure there are not many others in this Parliament who do not regret the deregulation of bus services, especially when we see how effectively, efficiently and cheaply Lothian buses work in Edinburgh. Would that we could have such a system in Aberdeen, but Mark Griffin and Ian Gray have not yet said and have yet to say where the money for this would be diverted from. Some members mentioned ports and airports, and I share Lewis MacDonald's hope that expansion of the Aberdeen port will be included in future government plans. I recently met with the port, as did my colleagues, and it is a very exciting project. I particularly appreciated Fiona MacLeod's contribution. Cycling has a very strong lobby in Scotland, but far, far more people walk, especially women and children, and safe streets for walking is something I ensure is given time and consideration in our committee's deliberations. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, Alec Johnson mentioned high-speed rail and his belief that it would only be delivered to Scotland by a Westminster government. To me, HSR demonstrates most visibly the London and South East-centric nature of the Westminster government, which is not listening and not concerned about England's North East and North West regions' economic futures, never mind Scotland's. In my view, only in an independent Scotland, with full responsibility for all modes of transport, ports and airports and air passenger duty, will the people of Scotland really get the integrated transport infrastructure they can fund and deserve.
Many thanks. Now call on Mary Fee to be followed by John Finney. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Government's motion states that investment in transport projects is vital to stimulate the economy now, securing long-term sustainable growth and providing a modern and efficient transport system fit for the 21st century. And whilst nobody can disagree with that statement, the primary focus of transport projects should be about providing a greater connectivity and easier journeys for commuters, and to provide crucial jobs and security for families. And the Labour amendment seeks to address the need for investment and modernisation to be of benefit to the consumer and the workforce. Re-regulation of the bus industry is necessary to address the challenges of the 21st century. The public want and deserve better buses, and that's why I support Ian Gray's bill. As a frequent bus user myself, I fully sympathise with those dependent on buses. Buses that rarely turn up on time, buses that are overcrowded, and even more often, buses that are dirty. And Ian Gray's bill aims to give transport authorities greater power on how bus services are run without having to seek ministers' consent. Too often in our communities we hear of services being withdrawn or reduced, no matter how much that community depends on the service. And by tendering successful routes with less successful routes, local people could benefit and not have the fear of losing a service worry them. And if any member in this chamber doubts this bill, I urge them to speak to their constituents. Over the last few months, that's exactly what I've been doing, and I've been asking residents in Renfrewshire their opinions on the bus services and their opinion on the Better Buses bill. Every reply I received backed the Better Buses bill and detailed their negative experience on the buses. And that's for a large urban area, not that far from Glasgow. So I can only imagine the misery that bus services cause for people living in more rural areas. The knock-on effects on health, employment and education caused by poor services is a challenge unmet in the 21st century. And with the Government's ambitious carbon reduction targets in mind, a rigorous national strategy needs to be developed to get more people out of their cars and onto public transport. Yet this can only be a realistic goal when we have a connected public transport system that meets the needs of people in rural and urban areas. And again, I ask members to consider not only their constituents' concerns about bus services, but remember that far more bus journeys are taken each day than train journeys, despite the Government focusing more often on rail. And Deputy Presiding Officer, Scottish Labour's Glasgow Airport rail link debate last week highlighted why an independent audit is required to investigate the loss of £30 million from the public purse. And during the debate, I raised the recent Audit Scotland report on key transport projects. And one of the key recommendations for the Scottish Government is to refine and develop its plan for scrutinising, challenging and monitoring major investment projects, which would undoubtedly lead to more accountability, so we would not have a repeat of the waste of taxpayers' money caused by the cancellation of Garrel. And over recent years, we have witnessed a number of projects which have faced delays and cancellations by the Government, which are undermining the development of our rail networks. And although to be welcomed, the Borders Railway project suffered a number of delays and cost increases. And that's another example of why Audit Scotland recommended that the Scottish Government should improve its openness and public accountability. However, it's not only the Scottish Government that was under fire from Audit Scotland. Transport Scotland has some recommendations it needs to take on board, despite the body having some good corporate governance structure for major investment projects. And I await both Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government meeting the deadline set within the recommendations. Deputy Presiding Officer, when debating the challenges of our transport system in the 21st century, it's only right we remember the wider implications our system plays in all areas of people's lives. From health and education to leisure and business and to employment, a well-connected, well-planned network of roads, rail and buses can make lives for the young and old simpler and safer. Thank you.
And thank you. We now call on John Finney, after which we'll move to closing speeches. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Minister mentioned in his opening address the unparalleled budget restraints there are placed on the Scottish Government, and I don't think that's in dispute, unless you look at the Tory amendment, that is, of course. And of course, what politics is about priorities and the competing demands there are, and it's quite evident that the motor lobby has a very strong voice that's being listened to. Can I express some disappointment that there's no mention of ferries at all? It's, to my mind, a vital part of our infrastructure, and as the motion talks about strategic transport networks, it seems strange to me that there wasn't a mention. There's good news for the Scottish Government connected with ferries. The Rassie ferry, an innovative design built in Scotland, and I would like to see that replicated with a replacement programme that would have some constructive use for our shipbuilding yards and see an enhanced, less polluting fleet. I was heartened to hear the Minister say, and I hope I noted him correctly, he's keen to encourage people to move from road to rail, and that's certainly heartening news. Of course, the practicalities of rail travel are what will shape people's view as to whether it's worthwhile or not, and I had a detailed email in from a constituent who travelled twice Inverness to Aberdeen at the weekend there, and he outlined the various challenges he felt that was connected with that, using the phrase, "We became a sardines tin after 26 got on at Inch, 50 at Inverurie and 15 at Dice." Now, that in one respect is good news that there's plenty of use being made. He had a similar experience in the return journey. But he does post a question why 10 years after being promised that the short platforms at Elgin and Inch would be lengthened, that hasn't happened. And that's what people are interested in. They want to see practical opportunities to use the rail. Disappointing, therefore, that with the A96 dualling, as things stand at the moment, the train is quicker than the road between Inverness and Aberdeen, but the Scottish Government seem intent in reversing that. And again, I would ask how that squares with the Minister's assertion that he wants to encourage people to move from road to rail. There must be a cost-benefits analysis done in respect of that. Modal shift is a phrase that's been used a lot, and that's not just freight, it is passengers as well. What analysis is done of that? Because we must make rail an attractive option. And part of that will be the way it integrates with other policies, not just other transport policies, but the policies connected with environment, planning, and the implications for development at the like of Kishorn would be important, how transport links with that. Reference has been made to a number of the briefings, and I'd like to talk about the one from Friends of the Earth and the pollution, air pollution and the damage that's done to health. We all want to encourage more cycling and walking and more and better public transport. So another thing we want to see. That will require less traffic. There's no doubt that the retrofit mention that the Minister makes is very welcome, and I think that's a very practical example of what we should be encouraging, which is inspecting, repairing and replacing in that order, not going straight to replacing. Can I commend, and this is unusual for me, can I commend something from the United States? It's a policy, it's available, and I can show the link to the Minister. Smart Growth America, it's called, and it's a research that's done that says public transportation investments generate 31% more jobs per dollar than new construction of roads and bridges, and repair work on roads and bridges generates 16% more jobs per dollar than new bridge and road construction. It goes on to say that fixing existing infrastructure produces a higher return on investment than new construction because repair prevents the need for reconstruction later, which sometimes costs 4 to 14 times as much, and it saves money by reducing damage to potholes and vibrations. Keeps existing communities vibrant. Neglecting existing places while building new infrastructure drives growth out and means the public ends up buying 2 of everything. Now, I don't think we have the money for that, so can I commend the inspect, repair and replace? Mention has been made of the Borders Rail, and I think that's very welcome and an absolutely good example of where consensus can be built. In a previous debate, I also commended the additional Oban-Glasgow rail service, which there's excellent connectivity with. People have talked about the shift, but of course the shift will require the infrastructure, and people have talked about the North Rail line. That's now at capacity, and it's for that reason I understand that the freight goes east and south rather than west and south. Rail and cycle hubs are very important too, but design is important, the right design forming part of the franchise so that there are storage areas both for cycles and for other matters, and that's matters I've been in touch with the Minister on previously. National
We're drawing to a close, please.
Yes, indeed. The national cycle rail work is very much welcomed, and more of that, please, Minister. Thank you.
Many thanks. And we now move to closing speeches, and I call on Alec Johnson. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think this has been a good and constructive debate. It's been a wide-ranging debate. Covered a lot of subjects. I've been criticised myself for not covering everything. I'll try to cover 1 or 2 more points in my closing remarks, but it has to be said that in a debate of this kind, we can't all expect to cover everything. So let me cover 1 or 2 of the things that I didn't cover earlier. First of all, there's the issue of cycling, which is in the government motion, and I intend to vote for that motion at 5 o'clock tonight. But it was covered at some length by my colleague Cameron Buchanan, who highlighted the fact that cycling has a lot to offer. It was also mentioned extensively by Fiona MacLeod, and I accept what she had to say. I was also interested in her suggestion that she was going to, was it Bishop Briggs, she was going to make the first 20-mile-per-hour town in Scotland. Well, I've occasionally driven out of Edinburgh at rush hour, and I think Edinburgh has already got you beat on that one, being significantly slower than 20 miles per hour. However, there are one or two key issues I think we need to cover, and rail is one that I would like to dwell on for a moment. I know that Scotland's rail industry is becoming more and more important, and even if I pass briefly on the issue of rail freight, if we look simply at the demand that passengers place on our rail services, we realise that demands are rising fast. I believe that it is vitally important that, as we develop new routes, we ensure that we have the scope within these routes to provide services for larger numbers of passengers. We've seen successful new stations and station expansions take place, resulting in significantly better improvements in passenger numbers than were in the business case. So I think we have scope to do a great deal with a limited resource in encouraging rail travel. It also has to be said that we do need to do more to cut journey times on the longer routes within Scotland. Passengers from Aberdeen and from Inverness remain concerned that nothing is being done to shorten journey times between these cities and the Central Belt. And if we are to take traffic off the roads, then that's where the challenge lies. However, the railways themselves, the infrastructure on which the trains run, will be expensive to improve in these areas, and there are many proposals which need to be considered quickly and enacted in order to achieve the objectives we want. Another issue which hasn't been touched on in relation to public transport is one that has been discussed on committee several times over the years, and I'll throw it in now to see if the Government are at a stage where they may be able to take this forward. And that is the idea of a Scotland-wide travel card. Now, we've spoken before about the possibility of having a card equivalent roughly to the Oyster card in London, and we have seen development of technology, particularly in relation to the concessionary fare scheme in Scotland, which begins to move us in that direction. There have been concerns that perhaps we're not quite ready to make that leap, but we haven't discussed it for a while, and I wonder if the Minister may take the opportunity to tell us if there is any progress in that area and whether we might be able to take that forward. Before we leave the rail issue, I must mention high-speed rail once again, because I do have some significant concerns about where the money will come from to bring the benefits of high-speed rail to Scotland and to pass that on to the cities further north. The costs involved there are likely to be extremely high. I do believe that it is time that this Government told us exactly what the funding mechanism it might choose to use to provide that level of rail development for a prospectively independent Scotland. It may be one of the issues that's covered in the White Paper, although I doubt it. But I look forward to hearing more from this Government about how that might be dealt with. Yes.
Can I just say, for his information, we are taking exactly the same approach which the UK Government took, which was to do the work first of all and then look at the funding once you know what the routes and the project comprises. That seems to be the sensible way to do it.
Johnson.
It does seem like a sensible way to do it, but it doesn't account for the fact that if Scotland were to become independent, then responsibility for a significant proportion of that rail network would fall on Scotland, because Scotland would be considered to have accrued the benefit. Finally, this has been a debate in which we've had our light-hearted moments. And I have to say that Chick Brodie produced the best remark of the entire debate when he suggested that we might seek to develop international or intergalactic travel from Prestwick Airport. I hope that that's a possibility in the long term, but I hope it doesn't go on to Chick suggesting that Ayr should be the site for some future Starfleet Academy, because let me assure Chick Brodie that thanks to the work of the BBC Chewing the Fat programme, Carnoustie is already well ahead in that campaign.
I'm overwhelmed. Thank you very much. We now call on James Kelly. 7 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to close the debate. As Jim Eadie said, transport infrastructure is an important issue, because it's not just about how people and groups get from A to B. It's about how you support our economy and how we help tackle and bring down the climate change emissions. So it feeds into key parts of the government's programme. And from that point of view, I was keen to look at the government's transport strategy, and helpfully Spice provided us as materials for the debate. So I opened the strategy up, and there was indeed a foreword from the Minister. The only problem was, and a photograph of the Minister as well, looking lean and keen. The only problem was it was Tavish Scott. And I thought to myself, well, Tavish Scott can't have joined the SNP, can he? Surely not. But indeed, when you looked at the date of the strategy, as was pointed out, was 2006. That was the last time that a transport strategy was produced. And I think that strategies aren't the be-all and end-all, but I think that is something of a flaw. This government have produced countless strategies. Recently we had an afternoon debating a place strategy, which I'm not against, but you would have thought that the starting point might have been a proper transport strategy. Yes, surely.
Jim Eadie.
Kelly, for taking an intervention. Do you not think you should give some credit to Transport Scotland, who produced a fairly comprehensive corporate plan up until 2015?
James Kelly.
Well, moving on indeed to the infrastructure plan, you know, if you look at that in terms of transport projects, 103 transport projects, you would think that's something to be welcomed. But again, examine the detail. 68% of those projects were no business case. And that brings me on to some of the issues that Ken McIntosh and Mary Fee highlighted in terms of Audit Scotland's report on transport infrastructure projects. With the exception of the Forth Crossing, Audit Scotland noted that the government had not informed Parliament or the public of the future estimated financial commitment on the main transport projects. And indeed, in terms of Egypt and Borders Rail, the business cases were not complete or up to date. So, you know, there are real issues about, you know, these are, as the members have, you know, enjoyed pointing out, there's vast sums of public money committed to these projects, but it appears that we don't have a proper monitoring system in place to see how the money is being spent. As Cameron Buchanan pointed out correctly, you need a properly thought through plan which involves the local authorities and assesses what needs to be done and also against what timescales these will be achieved. I think my colleague Mark Griffin was right to point out the glaring omission in the SNP motion, in that there was no mention of buses. It doesn't seem that the SNP are all that keen on buses, despite the fact that many journeys in Scotland take place by bus. A lot of communities who are isolated and not near rail stations really require bus routes. It's no accident, I think, that the SNP don't want to discuss buses, because they're cuts to the... yes, I will do, Mr.
Mark MacDonald.
I simply asked James Kelly, why then did his Labour colleagues in Aberdeen vote down the possibility of a publicly owned bus company in Aberdeen building on the model of Lothian buses, which could have been delivered without any need for any change to legislation whatsoever, if they are serious about reforming public transport?
James Kelly.
Well, I think the key thing for Mr MacDonald and also Ms Watt, who mentioned it, is Ian Gray's bus bill. And I welcome you to come forward and support a bill that will make a difference to communities throughout Scotland. Because what that bill will do is it will pass more power to local authorities like Aberdeen. It will give them power over routes and give them more power over bus companies. There was a challenge came from the Minister and also from Maureen Watt also as to how that would be funded. I think one of the interesting proposals in the bill is the way that the routes can be cross-subsidised to help support some of the routes that are currently being axed as a result of the lack of funding from the SNP government. And the other thing that I would point out is that we recently saw the SNP government capture £800,000 from Scottish Water in order to publicise the benefits of the white paper. I really got to say that I would rather see money and civil servants used to help support bus services in Scotland's communities than in a project which would separate us from the rest of the United Kingdom and put at risk, Alec Johnson's absolutely right, put at risk any potential benefits from high-speed rail. I think on the rail services itself, again, we've seen changes to the Egypt project, cuts of £350 million, but also, again, criticism from Audit Scotland as the timescales have slipped. There is not a proper and detailed plan as to how Egypt is going to... I will give way yet.
In his last minute, but on you go, Minister, briefly.
Given what's been said, and thanks for taking the intervention, does that mean that at the budget time you'll come forward with a proposal to spend £1 billion on bus re-regulation or put additional money into Egypt? Or is it just talk?
Mr Kelly, 20 seconds.
The point in terms of monies that I actually indicated, gave some practical suggestions on where you could find money. The point for you, Minister, is that you need a proper transport strategy, including for Egypt. It would be useful if you actually came to the Chamber and detailed when each of the phases are going to be delivered, because that has not happened. That has not happened to date.
You must sum it up, please. Very briefly.
Deputy Presiding Officer, we need a proper transport strategy, a plan that delivers for all the communities of Scotland and includes all the modes of transport, including buses, cycling and ferries.
Many thanks. Now call on Minister Keith Brown to wind up the debate. Please, Minister, you have 9 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and thank you all to those who participated in what's been generally quite an interesting and sometimes even consensual debate. The major transport projects which I mentioned at the start, though, play a very crucial part in connecting people and businesses across Scotland, and so do deserve the attention and recognition of the Parliament. Jim Eadie mentioned that transport infrastructure can appear to be boring to some people, and I think some members do tend to see a transport debate coming and then find a way to transport themselves somewhere else. And maybe that's the object of intergalactic travel and teleporting that Chick Brodie talked about as well. But it is very important to the economy of Scotland and also to connecting people in different communities across the country. And I do believe that we are transforming our strategic transport networks to realise that vision of a modern and efficient transport system fit for the 21st century. It connects our cities by fast and safe road and rail networks. It delivers high quality and complex projects on time and on budget. Since 2007, in fact, 23 major improvements to our motorways and trunk roads network. I think it's also true to say in relation to buses that we've substantially held to the investment levels, certainly of previous administrations, and it strikes me that when you do have a 26% cut to your capital budget to go against the motion, the amendment put forward in Alec Johnson's name, and also an 11% cut in your resource budget, and yet you maintain the same level of expenditure by and large in terms of buses, whether it's BSOG or the concessionary travel scheme, then I think that is a good record of support for buses. And that's before you mention the Green Bus and the bus investment initiatives, or even Fastlink, Glasgow Fastlink, or even the £300 million project for the subway in Glasgow. Not buses, but again, local transport. I think it's true to say that, unlike Tavish Scott, I don't have to worry about my popularity within the Labour group. And so let me say one or two things which wouldn't be any friends within the Labour group. First of all, if you look at the set of demands, we've heard about 4 or 5 demands from the Labour group tonight, none of which, of course, are costed, none of which they will ever come forward and actually propose in a budget, because they know to do that they have to find money somewhere else. And I think it was Nye Bevan that said that the language of politics is the language of priorities, and that's what you have to do. You have to say, if you're going to take something out, if you want to spend money on somewhere else, where is it going to come from? But to get an idea of the scale of the commitments which the Labour Party want to see, first of all, the reinstatement of the Garrow project, the reinstatement of the Errol project. I think, from what's been said, an additional £350 million for Egypt. Lower bus fares, more buses, more bus investment, lower ferry fares, more RET, which of course they never did when they were here, but it's been taken forward by this government. We've seen money being demanded for additional rail services, more ferries, more routes, money for the air discount scheme. All of these things, not least of course bus re-regulation, which the best estimates we can make on the bare bones of what's there already is around £1 billion to re-regulate bus services in this country. Everyone knows there's not the slightest prospect of the Labour Party coming forward with a single amendment which is going to propose one of these things, and it's the extent to which they're duping people by saying that they support these things when they've got no intention of putting their money or the taxpayers' money where their mouth is. Yes, I will.
The Minister likes to tell the Labour Party how it should behave in opposition and talks about duping people, but perhaps he could comment on his own manifesto, which his party were elected on, which fully committed to a full Egypt programme, and tell us how the government should fund their own manifesto commitment.
Minister Keith Brown.
I have said since from the start, I can't help it if the Labour Party choose not to listen, that we will do the full Egypt project. You didn't do it when you were in control, but we will certainly carry out that massive investment in the central belt of Scotland. And of course, we do get some idea of where the Labour Party's priorities lie. The latest proposal is to have trams in Aberdeen. That's the Labour Party's proposal. And we've heard it again today. I think it was expressed as light rail. That's the Labour Party's priority. It's not a priority that we share. No, I want to try and make some progress first of all. Not only in addition to that, I would say that we also have, despite what was said, this constant doom and gloom. Ken McIntosh said the government's talking about these projects and praising itself. We're logging what we've actually done and what we intend to do, but nothing but negativity in terms of the response, both from Ken McIntosh and to a certain extent from Mary Fee as well. All I'm saying is the fact that if you have a project, the biggest ever not just now, the biggest transport project ever undertaken in Scotland, the Forth Road crossing, and if you manage to get that delivered for about a £700 million saving, you might think that would merit a passing acknowledgement from the Labour Party, but no. Of course, their history of projects and transport projects in previous years as of constant overruns, failure to complete, like the M74, and also delays to completion. Yes, I'll give way now.
It says these are projects already done. Which of the projects, the Borders Railway, the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route, the A9 and the A96 dualling, has been done exactly?
I don't know if Ken McIntosh has been to the borders recently, but if he was to go, he would see construction right across the length of that route, something which the Labour Party never achieved in all its time in office. So I think that the point as well that was made by some fair enough points from Lewis MacDonald in terms of mitigation for the effects of HS2. The best and most effective mitigation for HS2 is HS3. That high-speed rail comes to Scotland, and then you won't have. And I think, Maureen, what was right to say that the study that was done is pretty flawed by not taking into account oil and gas. You won't have that disbenefit to either Aberdeen, Dundee or anywhere else in Scotland.
Even at the point at which high-speed rail does arrive in Glasgow and Edinburgh, the benefits for the north of Scotland will only be realised with investment in the rail infrastructure between the north of Scotland and the Central Belt.
We have said in relation both to high-speed rail coming to Scotland and between Edinburgh and Glasgow, which is our project, the benefits of that is the capacity that it releases for other routes, certainly to the north and to the south of Scotland. So that is a fair point. Can I say in relation to Rob Gibson's point that in relation to the A9, average speed cameras, I was in Thurso and in fact in Portgower earlier on this week and saw the work that was being undertaken there, and also the Berriedale Braes. There's no other way to get to Thurso to do that. And just to say that one of the misconceptions that appears to be there is that the average speed cameras will involve a reduction in speed limits, and that is not the case, of course, until, of course, we get to the construction part of that, when you have to reduce limits in order to ensure safety for those working on it. But the average speed cameras, of course, will come in the next year, and the final procurement and timescale for that we will shortly publish. It can also say, coming back to Alec Johnson's point, and again in particular to high-speed rail, and he makes the point, why would the UK government invest in high-speed rail, and especially why would they contribute towards the costs of that post-independence? And he said, incredibly, I think, at one point, that the only benefit to come from high-speed rail coming to Scotland accrues to Scotland. I think that fundamentally misunderstands the basis of high-speed rail, because even the UK government acknowledge that whether it's London, Manchester or Birmingham, there are profound benefits, business benefits, economic benefits for the whole of the current UK if we have that high-speed rail link. And really, I think, to find out that the UK government's position on high-speed rail coming to Scotland is that it's not top of our to-do list. Well, That may be the UK Government's position, but surely it's got to be the role for the Secretary of State for Scotland to put Scotland's case. It should be the top of his to-do list. And whether it's in relation to threatening people with losing shipyard jobs or not passing on money for agricultural purposes, his job is to fight for the Scottish interest. It should be the top of his list. That is the most profound thing we can do in terms of connecting the railways, obviously, between Scotland and the rest of the UK. And don't forget, of course, the extent to which the north east of England in particular feels very let down by the lack of recognition given in terms of the benefits for high-speed rail for that area as well. There are great things which can be achieved by high-speed rail. We cannot say, of course we can't say, as I said to Annabel Goldie earlier on today, exactly what the costs of that would be. We're doing the same as the UK Government did, which is to actually undertake the study which shows us the routes and the costs of that, and we'll produce that information. We asked them to do that 2 years ago. It's taken until last month for them to do that. We'd like to have produced that much earlier. But in conclusion, I would say that even if our ambitions aren't quite intergalactic, as Chick Brodie mentioned earlier on, we certainly do have ambitions. I mentioned the 26.5 miles of new railway built, the 6 new stations opened. The total investment in completed schemes, just to go back to the point previously, is £2 billion at this stage. We have over £4 billion of work under construction or in procurement, £6 billion for dualling the A9 between Perth and Inverness and the A96 between Inverness and Aberdeen, and we are the first government to commit to dualling both of those roads, something that should have been done decades ago. We also have investment of £5 billion going into our railways, which gives a lie to anybody who says that we're not concentrating at the same time on public investment. And together, these investments in road and rail will better connect our cities and help create the growth and jobs across this country. And that's the reason why I'd ask members to support this motion.
That concludes the debate on modernising Scotland's transport infrastructure, meeting the challenge of the 21st century. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 8288 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a business programme. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8288.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In moving the motion, Presiding Officer, I should confirm to members that I will bring forward another motion tomorrow which will remove business from Tuesday the 19th of November. Tonight's motion will allow next week's business to take place whilst respecting members' wishes to attend the funeral of our colleague Helen Eadie.
No member has asked to speak against the motion, therefore I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 8288 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of a Parliamentary Bureau motion. I'd ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8281 on approval of an SSI.
Formally moved.
The question on this motion will be put at decision time, to which we now come. There are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business. I wish to remind members that in relation to today's debate, if the amendment in the name of Mark Griffin is agreed, the amendment in the name of Alex Johnson fails. The first question is amendment number 8270.1 in the name of Mark Griffin, which seeks to amend motion number 8270 in the name of Keith Brown on modernising Scotland's transport infrastructure be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 8270.1 in the name of Mark Griffin is as follows. Yes, 38. No, 72. There were 4 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is amendment number 8270.3 in the name of Alex Johnson, which seeks to amend motion number 8270 in the name of Keith Brown on modernising Scotland's transport infrastructure be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 8270.3 in the name of Alex Johnson is as follows. Yes, 15. No, 95. There were 4 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8270 in the name of Keith Brown on modernising Scotland's transport infrastructure be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 8270 in the name of Keith Brown is as follows. Yes, 71. No, 39. There were 4 abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8281 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of an SSI be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who leave the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.